When people think about early Christianity, I think a lot of us assume there is one message, one faith, and one Jesus. But this history is a lot more chaotic than we often imagine. I'm very happy today to be joined yet again by Dr. Bart Ehrman to talk a little bit about a new class you have coming, Early Christian Heresies, and how that history is more fascinating and complicated than I think people really give credit to.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the thing is today people think of Christianity as a thing, but they know that it's actually lots of different things, right? I mean, Mormons are not the same as Greek Orthodox, and Roman Catholics aren't the same as Appalachian snake handlers. And I mean, these are all, they identify as Christian. And so we recognize in the modern period, but for some reason we have this idea that like it all started out as this monolith, and then eventually things started splitting off. And it turns out it's not that way. And it's pretty clearly it's not that way. My course is going to focus on the second and early third Christian centuries when we have clear cut and clear indications of lots of different heretical groups. But, it goes back to the New Testament. As I point out to my students, when Paul writes his letters, he has as many Christian enemies as he has friends who disagree with him on things.
Right.
And he thought they were wrong and they thought he was wrong. And so that kind of continues into more kind of serious developments in the second and third centuries.
So if you're interested, there's going to be a link down in the description. We're going to get into some of the complications here today, but your class is going to be going over this in greater depth. So I'd say if you are entering into the world of this for the first time, there's no better place to turn. In this immediate setup that you have here, and in the tagline, the description for your class, there's a real discussion of rivalry and competition and enemies, as you just said, which I think might be surprising. So can we start there? When you're using that framework, how competitive is this space?
Well, the only thing we have to go on are our ancient sources. And we've known for a long time that the group that scholars today call proto-Orthodox, so the people who have the views that eventually became standard traditional Christian views, that the proto-Orthodox authors of the end of the second into the third, fourth centuries wrote books against other people who claimed to be Christian who had what these authors claimed to be deadly wrong views. And they're quite serious. I mean, the Church Father Irenaeus writes 5 volumes against Gnostics. Tertullian writes 5 volumes against Marcionites. So, I mean, they're widespread, they're seen as dangerous. But now that we've discovered some of these alternative writings, they're attacking the proto-Orthodox. Mm-hmm. And so it's clearly a competition, and people are trying to show who's right and who's wrong.
Would individuals today recognize, as they're reading through these texts, I mean, maybe not just the ones who end up winning out, but as we hear from some of these voices who lost, would people identify or understand their positions as making sense in the space of Christianity?
Well, yeah, I mean, many do. Many would not admit it, but there are views that are held by many Christians today that were condemned as heresies early on. I mean, it's one example. There are a lot of Christians today will say that Jesus is both human and divine. Most Christians will say that. When I talk to my students and I start pressing them about, do you really think that he was human? And they kind of hedge on that one because, they're not comfortable thinking that Jesus ever made a mistake or that he didn't know something or that he had bodily functions or that he like things like that. He's like, well, yeah, no, not really. Or it's just like he just seemed that way. So, okay. So the idea that he seemed to be human was one of the first heresies to be condemned. It has a fancy name. They call it docetism, but it's a view that Jesus only seemed to be human. So there's that. But there's also, when the Gnostic library was discovered, the Gnostic Gospels, as people sometimes call them, in the 1960s, these started becoming public information, and there started sprouting up Gnostic churches, and there are. If you go to California, if you're in San Francisco or Los Angeles, someplace, look up on local churches, and you'll have Gnostic churches listed. So obviously, there are people who still resonate with this stuff.
Are all of these debates theological in nature, or is that the aspect that maybe gets the most attention from people? Those can be the ones they understand, but further down into the weeds, the divides move away from that space.
Yeah, a lot of the church fathers treated the issues as principally theological with ethical implications. And so one of the common charges against heretical groups is that they're highly immoral, that their views of God have led them into rather crass lifestyles, especially because there are a number of groups of early Christians who did not think that the world was created by the one true God. And because they looked around and the world sure seemed like a mess, and it doesn't seem likely to have been created by the good God. And so they posited there's some other divine force that created the world. And so and so the church fathers who attacked them said, yeah, well, they don't believe in the God of the Old Testament, and so like they break every law they can in order to show they oppose this God. And so a lot of times it looks like they're making stuff up, the church fathers, but both sides are making stuff up probably. The trick of the historian is to figure out what these groups were actually saying,
right?
And what what church fathers actually were thinking, and and how to figure out historically what was really going on.
When do those church fathers start to make these decisions to say we need to create distinctions or label something as heresy as opposed to our orthodoxy? Can we identify when that starts to be a concern?
Well, the idea of having the correct belief it goes all the way back into the writings of Paul, our first Christian author, who objects to other Christians who think, for example, that you have to be Jewish in order to be a follower of Jesus. And Paul's entire gospel message is that Christ's salvation comes to Gentiles as well as Jews. You don't have to become Jewish. And he's quite vehement about this in his letter to the Galatians, for example. And so that's an incorrect belief that leads to like a practical choice and like being circumcised. And so it goes all the way back there. And as soon as you have writings from outside the New Testament, the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, which in the early second around 110 or so, he's attacking groups that don't think Jesus is really human, or groups that think that you have to be Jewish. And it goes from there. They don't end up being called heretics until a little bit later, into the end of the second century. So the word heresy just means choice. And what these church fathers are saying is that these people have willfully chosen to believe the wrong things.
In that choosing to be then on the wrong side of their decision-making process, and you could have that community on the other side making the same argument back, what are the consequences for those communities are being marked to have chosen incorrectly?
Well, there isn't any sign of like physical persecution. It's not like the proto-Orthodox pull out the swords and start attacking people. They do verbally attack them and call them nasty things and say they're all going to hell. And so there are severe consequences for believing the wrong things in Christianity, which makes it, by the way, I'll get into this a little bit in my course, but it makes it quite unlike other religions in the ancient world. In ancient Jewish religion, but also in Greek and Roman religions, there weren't things like orthodoxy, the way we think of today, where you have to believe the right beliefs. That was nowhere near the radar of Greek and Roman religions. But Christianity insisted that there's one truth, and you have to believe it to be saved, but that means you got to know what the truth is. And if there are different variations of what that might be, that creates problems, but only for Christianity. So that's why you can have heresy there, but not in other places.
In the class, you're going to be focusing on early Christian heresies. And I think for a lot of our minds, we might jump to the framework of later perspectives, especially as far as the power dynamics go. How clear of a distinction is it in the way they talk about it or in the consequences that come in between those early Christian heresies that you're going to be discussing and some of what people might have in mind when they think about heresies or the consequences of being associated with that?
Well, I think different people have different conceptions. People who think in terms of the ancient world will sometimes think about the Arian controversy in the 4th century, where the Nicene Creed was a response to these teachings of Arius. And so they might think of that as a major thing. And then, you think about, you get into the Middle Ages where you have, inquisitions to make sure that you're believing the correct things. And so sometimes people think like that. There's usually lines of continuity that you can draw. between these various groups. By the time, I'll talk a little bit about 4th century things like Arius and the Arian controversy and the Council of Nicaea. I'll talk about that some. But at that point, the differences between the arguing parties are getting more and more refined and narrow and specific. Arius is taking a view that he's accused of an earlier heresy. He's accused of saying that Jesus is not really God, which is not what he's saying, actually, but he's defining it differently from how other people define God. Whereas there were earlier Christians who said, no, Jesus was a human. He's not God. And they really meant it. And whereas Arian is defining the term God in a way that he is God. He is God for Arius. But he's not equal with God. And so they charged him of having this older view of not thinking Jesus was God at all. And so there's continuity, and you can see the continuity all the way through. When you get into the Middle Ages, you have some heresies that in many ways are kind of like Gnosticism that you get early on. And so there are lines that you can trace.
When we're looking specifically at these early Christian heresies, are there any of them that, if we can remove the baggage that we have in looking back and try to place ourselves in their context, that seem to make good sense given the texts or the context that they are emerging from, that end up losing, that actually we might have suspected to have maybe won the day if things had gone a different way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the groups I'll be talking about is the followers of Marcion, who was a 2nd century church father and is sometimes seen as kind of the first really kind of major big-time heretic that the church went after. So he thought that the God of the Old Testament was not the God of the New Testament. That when God tells the Israelites to destroy Jericho and kill every man, woman, and child in it, that's not the same God as Jesus, who says, turn the other cheek and love your neighbor. They're different gods. And I think many people today, they won't say there are two gods, but they resonate with that. It does seem like a different God. And
right.
and Marcion started a large movement. Centuries later, church fathers had to tell people, like, if you're traveling to this city, be careful, because, you might end up in a Marcionite church and not know it. Because, basically they sound like everyone else, but they have these doctrinal things you won't understand the fine distinctions of.
The class starts on November 8th. And if someone is listening to this and thinking, I'm curious to hear more, what all can they expect in these sessions that they're going to be able to go through with you?
Yeah. So, I'm not going to presuppose a lot of background knowledge, but I am pitching it so like people who have background knowledge or people who don't have background knowledge are going to be able to get it. The issue is just how diverse, almost crazily diverse early Christianity is, that you can trace the roots of it already back into the New Testament, where you have various Christians claiming to be followers of Jesus, saying different things and having different beliefs. I'm going to focus on the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. I'll focus on groups like Marcion, who denied, for example, that Jesus really was a human being. I'll also talk about Jewish Christian groups who continue to maintain their Jewishness and said, look, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He came from the Jewish God. He fulfilled the Jewish scriptures. He's a Jewish teacher. We got to be Jews. and so you have those groups. And then you have Gnostic groups, which are, to many people, the most fascinating. And I'm going to explain a way people can understand what this Gnosticism thing was all about. And I'm going to be talking about books that were claimed by each of these various groups had books that claimed were written by apostles that supported their views, that said that, Jesus himself believed, there were 36 gods, or Jesus himself thought this, that, or the other thing. And so, well, how did we decide which books we'd have then? And who made those decisions? And who decided what was going to be orthodox? And so we'll be doing all of those issues for the first 2 or 3 centuries.
It's an exceptionally complicated world to try to unpack. So if you are interested in learning more about early Christian heresies, and as Bart mentioned here, maybe some of these heresies that might still be floating around today in the way you or people perceive some things, I'd recommend taking a look. The link is down in the description. The class starts November 8th, so if you go sign up now, you can join those sessions in person with Dr. Bart Ehrman. Bart, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk. I think the world of heresies is a fascinating, complex, competitive space, as you mentioned, so I'm really looking forward to this class.
Well, thanks. I'm looking forward to it too. It's good material that a lot of people don't know, and once they find out about it, wow, that is interesting.
It's one of the topics that once you start to go down the rabbit hole can just keep going for you. You're starting off with early Christian heresies here, and there's many periods after that, if you are fascinated, that you can continue to go down. So again, link in the description. Go and sign up now. The class starts November 8th. Bart, thank you so much for taking the time.
Okay, thank you.